Welcome, everyone. We appreciate you attending the panels today with TIGS. This is the official last topic panel for TIGS of 2020. As Eve had shared, approaches to mental health support and awareness in games. My name is Dr. Sarah Hayes, and I'm a clinical contributor for Take This. I'm also a licensed clinician virtually in the Seattle, Washington area, and I'm a vice president of Queer Women of Esports. So welcome, everyone. Before we begin, I'd like to do just a little bit of caretaking. Please be aware that during this discussion, we may address topics that are difficult, like suicide, thoughts of self-harm, mental illness, experiences that might be really difficult to hear about. So if anything is bothersome or triggering to you, as much as I wish I had more options, the only one that we have, especially virtually here, is if you need to step away, please feel free to do so. Take care of yourself and have the boundaries that you need to stay healthy and be well. And then if you have any questions or concerns, you can find my contact information at www.takethis.org. If you have any thoughts or needed to follow up and be like, I couldn't be part of that conversation, but I really wanted to hear what was said, I'd be happy to fill you in a way that is more respectful to your boundaries. And then without further ado, I'd love to have our panelists introduce themselves. So why don't we start off with Rosemary? Will you introduce yourself for us here? Oh, I think you're muted.
Excellent.
There we go.
And what happens? We're muted. Great start.
Okay.
So thank you so much for having me here. It's been really exciting also to listen to some of the other panelists and see a lot of similarities in here as well. So I think that's really great. So my name's Rosie. I have been working with a nonprofit organization for the last 5 years on building a game called Shadow's Edge. It is a self-help game for teens and young adults. So we're helping them process tough things that are happening to them in their life, as obviously here this year we all have had. So we've been super, super duper busy in this last year, but the game has existed quite a bit longer. And so, yeah, that's basically what I'm working on, bringing self-help tool digitally, not just the game, but also other digital projects to our young audience.
Excellent. Who'd like to go next? Oh, go ahead.
Sure. Hi, everyone. I'm Dr. Gabe Pappalardo. Thanks so much to Take This and TIGS for having us all. It's been a really cool conference so far. I am the founder of Six Wing Studios. We are also working on a mental health focused game. We're working on Amaru, the self-care virtual pet, and this is Amaru. He says hello. What we are doing is very, I guess, similar to Rosemary, is trying to create gamified solutions that are helping people to be empowered outside of their game. So what we want people to do is be able to check in with their pet, but then check in with themselves, learn tools like mindfulness meditation and gratitude journaling, things that we know are clinically proven to show that they can help with their anxiety and depression and gain some more empowerment. And so we're really excited to bring that to the world. So thanks for having me.
Excellent. And last but certainly not least.
Hi, everybody. I'm Swatee Survey. I'm founder and CEO of Lightsprite. And we build games to help people manage chronic health conditions. And our first one is a clinically validated mental health video game. It is a self-help tool. It's the first to win a U.S. Surgeon General Award and the only one recommended by clinicians and payers today.
Excellent. Well, thank you all so much for being here today. As you shared and demonstrated, you all have done very impressive things in game development and addressing mental health. So I'd like to just get into a little bit of that meat of really, I wanted to start off talking about gamification. And so when we think about gamification, sometimes it's harder to do things when we're trying to live day to day, especially right now, especially in COVID. When mental illness is present, this compounds. And so in some contexts, I know that gamification is used to help with learning. In others, it's in training or preparing for things like surgery or flying airplanes. And yet in others, in supporting people in their ongoing life goals. So I'm just curious, as a person who cares deeply about semantics, how would all of you define gamification? Why don't we mix it up and start maybe with Swatee?
It's a great question. I actually was having this conversation earlier today with some research partners at sunny Stony Brook in New York. And because gamification, at least in the healthcare space, has been around for a while, and the use of games is quite familiar. And even with insurance companies, it's not a new thing, in health insurance specifically. And this is something that we always have to do, is explain the difference between gamification versus a game, right?
Mm-hmm.
And people in the gaming industry understand that, but the way I've talked about it is gamification is really task driven and task based. So you're trying to achieve one thing or a series of steps, whereas a game is immersive. It can be escape, and it may actually, it's not about efficiency. A game's not necessarily about efficiency and achieving an end goal. So, I actually wrote an essay that was on some health transformer website specifically about that. And another way to think about it is gamification is using the tools, whereas a game is the house. So you have a toolbox, which are the mechanics, and then the game itself is the house. So that's kind of the way we've had to do quite a bit of education on that difference. And then once you make that mind shift, then people begin to understand, oh, I see what you're talking about.
It's an excellent analogy. I love it. Who would like to go next?
Just to build on that, kind of taking from Jesse Schell's stuff, like the art of game design, exactly what Swatee was just saying there. So things like mechanics, aesthetics, narrative, different pieces that make what we know to be a game, and introducing those into non-game environments in a way that takes things in sort of the direction of a game. I think that a game is on a spectrum, right? I think that some things are gamey and some things are fully games, and maybe some things are not games at all. But if we're finding a way to bring sort of exploration, curiosity, fun, engagement, creativity to sort of maybe something that isn't traditionally in that space, I could say that we're engaging in gamification. I'm not a clinician by trade. I have an industrial organizational psychology background. So that's a lot of workplace trainings, serious games types trainings. Mm-hmm. Gamification is finding itself more and more into places of skill acquisition. And I think what's really beneficial for bringing this into this space is, especially for something like a practice of self-care, when people are trying to establish something new for themselves, maybe to take care of themselves, especially when you're feeling particularly low. I think the drop-off rate is probably very high, right? So if we can find ways to use game mechanics to scaffold people's motivation, to keep them sustained in their practice long enough to get benefit, then I think we've really achieved something.
Excellent.
Yeah, I think most of it's been said. One of the things that I would also add is that in games you have, generally a made-up kind of world and set of rules. And if you can bring some of that gaming world set and rules into the real world, and you start connecting the dots, that's exactly also where all of us, are what we're trying to do. We're trying to create things that people can then apply in their real lives, and that they can then really learn and gain something from. Obviously, that's something that exists in the game world as well, but I think it's more obvious in gamification that you are still in that real world, and that you are who you are and where you are.
Excellent. Wonderful. Now, all of you have started discussing, even in your descriptions of gamification, that there is benefits to it with health. When it comes to this promotion of mental health, what led you to pairing it with gamification to create a game?
I'll go first. On our side, we really specifically wanted to reach teens and young adults, but specifically also teens. And we came from the psychology side. So our nonprofit has been around for quite a while, and we've published a book, a self-help book. We've really focused on kids and on teens. And we wanted something that felt natural to them. And if you are looking to connect with teens, that's where they live. They're on their devices, right? And they're playing games. There's so many gamers in the world, I think 2.6 billion at the moment. So it's just something they understand and that they know. And so with our psychologists and with our child life specialists and even some of our patients that we have, because like Swatee also, we started out for chronic illnesses and serious illnesses, and we've widened it since. But the idea there was that we really wanted to bring something to them in a medium that they feel comfortable with, so that we bring the content to them instead of making them come to to us. And we really also wanted it to complement classic therapy and therapeutic methods, so that it's something that they can really in a playful way use it. And last but not least, I think also, you know, play has been used in psychology for hundreds of years, right? That's not something new. We're just now taking it digital.
That's true.
So like for me, I spent a lot of my career in actually building technology for healthcare specifically. And it started a really long time ago, looking at how technology could be applied at the patient side. And that field now today is called digital health. And as I kept looking at the different applications and what would actually work and resonate, there's a mounting body of evidence around how gaming or gaming tools, and mainly in the extra gaming space, would actually improve the health outcomes. But there weren't really a lot of commercial efforts at the time I started Lightsprite. So I said, well, why don't we actually try to do something? And then as we started looking, this was in 2013, 2014, just to give you a timeline of when I started the company. And when we started looking at it, nobody was addressing mental health at all. It was all around extra gaming. And that was really it. Zombies Run had come out, all of that stuff. So mental health was already stigmatized, but nobody was really even looking at how you can create an interactive experience. So, but really, if you're trying to change behaviors to have a clinical outcome, you really have to get the patient involved. And so for the reasons that Rosemary's talked about, games are really approachable. They can teach skills. They also reduce the stigma, right? Like I was just on a presentation right now with a bunch of health folks in Alaska. I mean, you see this background, this is our next version. This doesn't look like a mental health app at all. It looks like something you just play. So, and literally I had our new web designer came on board and he literally said, your app is the only one that talks about stress that doesn't stress me out. So
that's remarkable.
And he had not, we just hired him like a week ago. He's like, I use all of them. I use Headspace. I use all of them. And yours is the only one I've seen of it like its kind. So I think that speaks to that notion of narrative. It's interactive is what he said. All of the things that we talk about in games, emotion, evocativeness. He loves the character. Socks was right there on my shoulder. It reminds him of his dogs. So all of these things which are familiar and known for folks in the gaming community, outside of that, it's really hard. And then that translates into engagement, and then that translates into clinical outcomes. So
that's right.
Cool. Gosh, it's so cool just to be on calls with everyone working in the space. It's really beautiful. So my story is it's a bit more personal. I've struggled with anxiety and depression my entire life. I actually lost my brother to suicide when I was 16 as well. So it's been in my family. And I had a moment in my life where kind of outside of graduate school, I had a burnout period. And I discovered mindfulness meditation and yoga. I actually lived in a yoga community for about 4 months and got a teacher certification and really kind of put myself back together. And there was a time where I was just like, the types of skills that I learned for managing depression and anxiety in those spaces, I was just like, oh my gosh, do I wish that I could have found this earlier in my life? Like, wouldn't it have been wonderful if I had found it when I was 12, 13, 14 instead of, 28? And so I got fascinated with this idea of how can we get those types of skills out there more. And I also was using apps like Headspace and Calm and things like that, which are phenomenal products. They're wonderful. But I think, again, what we're talking about, the power of gamification, I think is in sustaining that motivation to stick with a practice. Because if you're trying to do something that requires the building of a habit, we know that it takes 2 months, right? 2 months of regular practice to get that habit really ingrained. And so if we can design the game systems, design the reinforcement systems, the leveling systems, et cetera, to scaffold over that 2-month period, then we know that people can actually have that skill acquisition and take it back out. So I actually looked at a lot of different things. I started with like neuroperipherals, like looking at like the Muse headband and stuff like that. There's actually some really cool products using those as well. But kind of to Rosemary's point, meeting people where they are, when I saw the statistic of 63% increase in depression in 12 to 17-year-olds in 3 years, and that was before COVID, I was like, holy wow. And so 60% of Americans are playing video games today. So what a powerful medium to get this stuff out. And like Rosemary said, these young people are primarily on their devices. So let's meet them where they are and bring it to them. And then just like Swatee was saying, the aesthetic presentation of it being something that is already intrinsically sort of attractive, that promotes that curiosity and brings people and wants them to engage in it. I think that all of this together, we have a real opportunity to get like self-care at scale out to the world. And so that's what really inspired me to get in the game.
That's wonderful. Gosh, all of you are so inspiring. Makes me think about, like, as a clinician, I specialize in geek therapy and I use video games and gaming in my practice and I think I've referred to every single one of your apps, to be honest. So it's just really exciting to be able to discuss it. And now I know that we've already kind of danced around this. And so I'd like to go ahead and I'm going to ask a leading question, since I can make the assumption that you all value mental wellness. Why do you believe that it's important to incorporate or even highlight mental illness in games? And if you disagree, feel free to voice so, but I hope that's not too much of an assumption.
Well, I think, again, I see it just as a perfect medium for skill acquisition. And I think that, there's tremendous benefit that can come from therapy. There's tremendous benefit that can come from medication. But I think one thing that I've noticed a lot is that I'll talk to people. I talk to people at a mental health conference. I talk to people, just gamers themselves. And there's sort of an underlying motivation that they share, which is that I want to empower myself to have greater control over my mental well-being so that I can help other people. Like, that's something that I just heard over and over again. And so I think that by using, again, this medium to get these skills of empowerment out there, even for people for whom maybe can't afford therapy or if medication has conflicts or side effects or things like that. I mean, not to say that any of these products necessarily should replace any of that stuff, but I just think it's another tool in a tool belt, and I think that this is just a great medium for getting those tools out there. So I think that we should leverage it. We have the technology, we have the talent, so let's do it.
Definitely valuable on that holistic approach. Sorry, go ahead, Swatee.
No, I mean, for me, it's about health in general first. So, and so to me, you talk about the holistic, it's integrated, and there's been a lot of studies that shown poor mental health leads to poor physical health. In fact, one statistic is if you have a chronic physical illness and you have a diagnosis of a mental health issue, your cost of care goes up 2 to 3x than a standard patient. So really, it's really more about that holistic piece. And we consider our tool to be used as an adjunct. So meaning that, because we collect a lot of really valuable player information then that therapists can actually use as part of therapy. We can actually, doctors can actually bill for it. And that's because there's information or there's screening information we collect. So, if you're going to talk about it's not so much about coming at it from I want to help mental illness, and so we are going to highlight it in games because people are there. Rather, it's very, very patient forward or consumer forward, which is we want to improve the life of an individual, and where are they going to interact, and where are you going to be able to get their mind share, and that's a function of their own mental state. And quite often with the patient, they're not just compromised, they're compromised in several ways. They're compromised in emotionally, they can be compromised physically, they can be compromised financially. So keeping that in mind and creating those experiences that can be respectful and empathetic to that, then you actually get to that endpoint of at least for us, which is a healthy person.
Yeah, I think those are all some great points. I think there is a good role for mainstream games to help sort of destigmatize certain topics and also to raise awareness that certain issues exist. I think there's a danger in just calling it out as mental illness rather than mental health, just because also that is a very tricky one to really portray correctly in games. And if you are trying to raise awareness, to do that in a way that doesn't actually cause any harm. But it is something that we see in a lot of games that is happening.
Mm-hmm.
I agree with Swatee and Gabe that, you know, we're talking a little bit more about just helping the journey of a person. So we came from the clinical side, we came from the patient side, just like Swatee. We did a clinical trial with cancer patients, with 175 cancer patients with Lowers Children's Hospital. We also had an impact study that was helped by the Dutch Emotional Health Organization in the Netherlands, by the Dutch government, as well as University of Positive Psychology. And so we also came from that angle. And I think that the difference between what we're all trying to do, or what we're all doing, is that we're trying to move these people that have had hardship, whether that be like a chronic or serious illness, or you know, stress or anxiety levels, for example. We're trying to move them through a process of understanding themselves better and being able to handle what they're going through better, and thus hopefully becoming mentally more healthy. So in our case, we've been able to prove that people become more resilient after 6 weeks of play. And I've seen some studies on Swatee's game as well, and I'd love to hear some more about Gabe as well on what that game, you know, really what the results of those games are, because I think that's the most satisfying part. And I think that is something where, you know, if we have a link with mainstream gaming where they can raise awareness about those types of situations, and that games can help, and that there's a lot out there also for the people that play games, because a lot of them do have those issues, right? Then I think that's something that could be very helpful on just the mainstream side.
I'm so glad you brought up that distinction between mental health and mental illness. This is exactly why I used the wording that I did in that question, because I know that it can get, I knew you all, of course, would address it very well, because your efforts are distinctly in the aim of improving mental health. And mental illness is present, thus the need for effort on the part of mental health. And for the audience, this is an important distinction, as has been discussed, and also because suffering from mental illness is an experience. Working on your mental health is a lifetime journey. And so having a diagnosis, it complicates life and makes things difficult, and apps and games like our lovely panelists have created are so helpful in improving that journey, but also that like there is a difference. And so when we're talking about it, it's important to pay attention to those semantics, because the ways that games approach them are very different and distinct. Like you're saying, there can be reliance upon stereotypes when it comes to representation of mental illness in games, and that can be incredibly dangerous very quickly. And I know that here at TIGS and Broad Scale, there are a lot of folks with distinct efforts towards portraying them well. I know there's been some discussion of some games earlier today on a few panels on this effect, but there's also just real value in showing examples of how to improve and create mental wellness and help people feel hopeful in that regard. So thank you for addressing this in such a nuanced and wonderful way.
If I may add, I mean, it's also for the player, it's very daunting sometimes, right?
Yeah.
Because there's so many, if you look at mental illness versus mental health, for example, there's so many different, as Gabe mentioned, you know, so many different shades and so many different levels and on the spectrum of what your issue could be. It could just be, you know, being anxious because there's a test, or because we had COVID, or because you don't know, you know, how you're going to do your high school dance. That can be a very, very valid thing that you're really, really struggling with. Mm-hmm. But it can also be very valid to have gone through chemotherapy for the 3rd time and just not know, is it even worth it for me to go to college, because I'll get it anyways again. And so, you know, there's so many different ways, and I think it's just very difficult to have a one size fit all. And therefore, I think it's just some caution on really, you know, using those representations in there that people might sort of feel themselves driven to, if you will.
Sure. And also as well, like, you know, we have focused in our game on self-care. And the reason that we chose to go with self-care is that we are not an FDA approved game. You know, we cannot say that our game treats capital D depression or capital A anxiety or any of those things, right? But we do know that stress is a universal human experience. Getting down is a universal human experience. Feeling the need to build resilience to push through these experiences, that's a universal human experience. So just to be perfectly clear from a representation standpoint, you know, we are not saying that we are some sort of FDA certified, you know, solution to your problems. But what we are saying is that the tools that we provide through these games, you know, things like mindfulness meditation, things like gratitude journaling, we know that there's a 50-year history of peer-reviewed research showing that, you know, these types of things help. And these are things that yoga teachers teach. They are things that therapists teach. They are things that, you know, these are self-care skills, right? So yeah, when we are talking about these things, I think the capital D depression and the lowercase d depression, the capital A anxiety, lower A anxiety, we do have to be careful with some of the nuances there. But I think what we're all trying to do is trying to empower people at the end of the day.
It's a beautiful point. I think empowerment is something that is so valuable, especially right now when it's hard to get services into the hands of lots of folks. I know that as a practitioner of therapy, it's harder to get people to buy into therapy when it's like this. And it's more intimidating to find a provider when it's like, well, who knows what's going on in their environment? Who knows what, I mean, like I am using a green screen right now, but usually like people see my couches with my dogs running around because it's comforting for them to know that there's nothing else going on in my background, so they can see a little bit more of that like humanity and know that they're safe to share what they need to share. That's why I wear the big headphones. So like having an app that is private and personal to you is so valuable to go on your own journey of mental health and to work on those things without the judgment and the shame and some of the stigma that we see sometimes attached to more direct person-to-person services. So I know that earlier, Swatee, you brought up that you've got a lot of data that you collect about the folks who use and benefit from your app. And I'm just so curious, the scientist in me can't help but ask generally, what benefits have you all found with your games providing support for mental illness and the improvement of mental health?
What we've seen so far is that we've looked at several depression screens that are, or several mental health screens that are used by providers today. So you'll be familiar with these. It's the GAD, did the GAD-7, the PHQ-8, and then we also did the coping skills survey. So GAD is for anxiety, and then the PHQ is for depression. So these are commonly, generally accepted tools that you'll find everywhere. And so in a self-directed care fashion, because we can actually span that care continuum, it can be used independently, or if you're in a clinical setting, it can actually be administered with patients. And so the diagnoses that we've worked with are anxiety, depression, PTSD, bipolar, and then also severely mentally ill. And typically what we've seen is everybody across the board had basically a step level improvement. And in general, it was about a 2.5 point reduction in the depression scales. And that's equal, on self-directed care. So, and we also have engagement rates that are 2x above Headspace and 3x above the industry average.
Wow, congratulations.
No kidding. That's a remarkable statistic. For those who aren't unaware, on these questionnaires, you can score anything from 0 or 2-ish points to like roughly 24. It varies from survey to survey, but that kind of a shift is really remarkable clinically, and a similar way to how clinicians measure improvement with their clients as well in treatment planning. So,
yeah, and then the real world impact typically is someone being able to get out of bed and go to work 2 more days each week. Yeah, is typically how that ends up translating. So you can imagine the productivity costs or the productivity gains from an employer perspective, and then the health outcomes. So, so that's kind of the information that we share. And yeah, it is. And we're also seeing it on the anxiety scales, but I I think it just depends on your baseline. And I think we had and this is real world evidence. So the other thing is that these are not, these are real world evidence. So it's basically if someone were to take the app off the App Store, download it and use it. So it was, and that's a new body of a way of testing and doing clinical validation for
Very
all
different
kinds of interventions.
Yeah.
Because the clinical trial approach, you know, nobody will be using mobile apps anymore by the time the evidence comes out. So
Yeah.
So yeah.
Wonderful.
Does that answer your question?
Yeah. Yes. And how about Rosemary? Have you learned anything about how Shadow's Edge has improved?
Yeah. So on top of those types of scales, what we also did is we did an in-depth, just really analysis of what people are talking about. So for example, our game is based on two principles, which is narrative therapy and then artistic expression. So in the game, similar to what Gabe said, right? We bring them to a habit of journaling. We have some mindfulness exercises in there. And then we also do exercises around art therapy, basically, and similar to art therapy. It's not clinically proven, the art therapy part, but just really to help them be able to vent. As you can see behind me, you know, that's part of our game world as well. And they get to create street art and really just express themselves that way, and then express that in a community. And so we've done a lot of testing also, we've worked with probably by now over 500 different teens and young adults.
Wow.
On the game itself, and work with institutions on how do you then measure that these things are effective. Because one thing is like anxiety and depression scale, but we also want to know how they are feeling, not just monitoring them, but really try to see, you know, what do they gain from it and how do they gain things from it. And that for us has been really rewarding, because we have so many, you know, testimonials that they're saying how it changed their life. We've had just recently, we've had a very unfortunate case where there was somebody that was suicidal that we've been able to help, which has been great, you know. So there's a lot of good stuff that is narrative coming out of it, as well as quantitative. And also from the clinical study, obviously we looked at things like biometrics as well. How do they feel when they play? How does heart rate and all those kinds of things go up? We've measured how long they play versus how they then feel afterwards. I mean, those are all the similar scale things. And then we've done sort of we've taken the diary entries, we've totally anonymized those, and just started looking at patterns. You know, what are the patterns that we can see? What are people do? Like, for example, words like sad pop up a lot of times, or do, you know, where are the themes, so that we can really, for us, the main aim for that was that we can provide different and new content within the game, because it's not just a game where you play through. We have different levels that get you through, just like you would on a journey of emotional healing. But also we have a way of refreshing challenges and exercises, so we keep it up to date. We saw with COVID, for example, and just in the last 4 months, we saw a lot in our community about racism, about COVID, about insecurity, about, you know, people in the US talking about wanting to seek political asylum. And those are young people, right? We have people from 16 to 24 in there mainly. And so we've been able to then really adapt our game to it and create certain challenges, art therapy challenges, you know, journaling exercises, things to think about and write about that really fits to what our community needed at that point in time. And then we've analyzed how that has worked out, and if they felt better and what their feedback was. That makes sense.
That's beautiful. For those who are unaware, narrative therapy is a strategy used in traditional therapy interventions where you help people reframe the way that they understand and think about the story of their life in order to help them feel more empowered and better about themselves and about the way forward. Also, there's a lot of data that points to where in games like Stardew Valley or like Shadow's Edge, or where you have exploration and kind of more of the sandbox format where it's an open world that you get to make choices about what you do, there's a lot of feelings that improve competency and feel like you have more control. Whereas like in youth, a common coping tactic when they feel like they have no control is to withhold eating or control their own eating, because that's something that they have to be able to manage because we can't make them chew or swallow. But this gives them a different outlet. And so I think that's absolutely fascinating that you're finding similar things and able to adapt your game so quickly. I want to
And
give
that's the strength of the game, right?
Yeah.
Not just our game, but any game. One of the strengths of the game is that versus, for example, watching a movie about somebody that has a chronic illness or is terminally ill, where you get the story and you can react to it, but that's all you can do. In gaming, you can give them an active role to change something. So you can use story, you can use the metaphors. In our case, it's the metaphor of a city hit by a storm, and you have to restore that world and heal that world to be able to bring back the citizens. And so you can use those metaphors also, in that storyline, but give them an active role in that story, which is a little bit different from books or maybe movies. And I'm sure, Gabe, in yours, that's a similar principle, right?
Yeah, absolutely. The narrative component is huge. It gets back to, again, when we were looking at the type of game that we wanted to make, and we will still make this game one day, but my original idea was to do a sort of Hollow Knight style Metroidvania. But the more we talked to people, and the more we learned about that altruistic desire, I want to get better so that I can help someone else, the mutually supportive relationship of a virtual pet just made sense. And so that's where we decided to go with it. And so within the game of Amaru, it's about helping Amaru find his way home. He's gotten lost, he's far from home. You develop a bond that levels up. You have an aura that levels up when you do your self-care. You level up both of these stats, and it progresses this story about bringing Amaru home, right? So this idea of I get empowered, which helps me empower this pet, plays into that motivation that we had talked about. To get back to the question of the data and stuff that's coming, we're still very new. So what we have is, we've had about 16,000 people download sort of our beta and demo, and that led us to do a Kickstarter, which was successful. So we got funding to continue to develop the rest of the app, which is very exciting. So right now we haven't done any sort of classroom or clinical studies. We do get a lot of anecdotal evidence that's, people like, the messages are what help keep us going on the hard days. Cause when I'm sure you've received these as well, someone says, I was at work and having a giant imposter syndrome attack, and I did the breathing exercise in the game and it pulled me out of the negative spiral and I was able to get on with my day. Like, we get enough of those testimonial types that we know that we're onto something here. And we definitely have enough sort of university and classroom connections that when the game is, shippable and ready to go and in the App Store, we're looking forward to getting into the hands of some people and coming back with some cool data. I wanted to also ask a little bit, but actually I'll wait till the end, but I wanted to ask about data. No? Okay.
Go ahead. Yeah.
Okay, sure. Well, just like the sensitivity of this data and the protection that needs to go into this data, and also of communities around the game. One thing that we discovered was, the community that our game attracted was a lot of young people with anxiety and depression. And so we found ourselves in our Discord community with people pouring their hearts out to the internet. And, we had to be like, whoa, 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 whoa. Like, you're sharing a tremendous amount of personal information online with a lot of strangers. Whew, let's not do that. And so we all got trained. My team, every one of my team has gone through mental health first aid training. Thank you to Anxiety for turning us onto that. It's a really powerful resource.
Love
yeah, I love her. And and from there also, we've also partnered with like Guardians Mental Health to have, some additional people that, they are truly that. They are truly a guardian angels online to help divert people to resources. But I would say, so like, I take it if you're gathering this types of data, like, I guess, are you university affiliated? Do you have kind of like IRBs and things like that help to keep the data protected, or how does that all, I see there's some chat questions as well about sort of clinical validation. So I didn't know if you wanted to dig into that.
Absolutely.
Oh, I see.
Go ahead. Yeah.
Oh, okay. I didn't even see that.
Basically, sorry, a rambling question, but to tie it together,
Right.
how do we go about protecting the sensitive data of young people playing our games?
Is that the
in our
question in the
case,
chat?
Yeah, go ahead, Swatee.
No, is that the question in the chat?
Oh no, it kind of tying together. We're talking about clinical validation. We're talking about data. I think people just want to hear more about this as a topic.
Because it's like magical, right? We have data that we have outcomes. We can say this is a 2-point improvement on these scales, and it's more of like how do you go about structuring that? Because the hard part about good science, right? And this was even going to be my commentary after you spoke, Gabe, is that like right now you don't have hard numbers like what the other panelists are discussing, but that doesn't mean that what you're doing isn't impactful, and it is hard to get those numbers because how do you structure a study? And we've kind of alluded to this a little bit, so.
Well, yeah,
go
I
ahead.
mean, there's a lot of different approaches, right? And
Yeah.
you ultimately have to, it's a business decision. Like, what do you want to be? Do you want to be a lifestyle brand? Do you want to be in the game space, or are you a digital therapeutic, right? Or are you somewhere in between? And the problem, at least, like, we're a healthcare company, first and foremost. So, and the game is a front end interface for the patient or an individual, right? But then who we sell to are insurance companies and health systems, employer groups. We will have a D2C component, which we're actually launching right now just because of the surge of demand that we've seen due to COVID. But you have to make a business decision on it. It's really, if you're running a company, you have to figure out what kind of infrastructure on the back end that you want. And so for us, you know, our first deployment was on an active military base. And so, you know, we met all the HIPAA compliance guidance and protocols and PHI. We've had to sign BAAs, which are business associate agreements, which are pretty standard in the healthcare world. So it's, for us, it's not a big deal. I actually had that question today too. And we've had one of our strategic investors is Bayer Pharmaceuticals. You might be familiar with them. And so they did an audit on our back end. And then there's also we'll have SOX 2 compliance that we'll have to go through. So that's just something, it's just, depends on where you want to play. Now, Headspace and Calm, I know Headspace is trying to build a digital therapeutic like us. You know, and we don't necessarily intend to be, we were already prescribed, you know, we go for FDA approval as needed, but it's not a requisite for us to commercialize the product. Yeah. So it's really about business decision. It's also about brand and trust. I mean, the journal entries that we end up getting are actually quite sensitive. And, you know, and then it's about how do you communicate with end users, right? And what kind of experience do you have? I mean, we don't, for one thing we don't do is we don't do a Facebook login. There's no way you can share Facebook. And that's such a common thing, or Google sign up. We don't do that. Because that's a real indicator that it's a closed off, like in terms of PHI, personal information, it is closed off. And that's actually a benefit in this particular scenario, right? So I think that's really, it's really a business decision, and where do you want to go? Because that all also costs money. Right?
Oh yeah.
Pull it up.
Yeah, no, it's, yeah, thank you for sharing all that. That's very, like, really cool to hear all the work that you put in. And yeah, I mean, just I guess the major point being just that this is sensitive data. Like, this is like really, really sensitive data. So, like, you know, one thing that we've done kind of as a, like, because like Swatee was saying, I mean, it's going to take time and money to build the infrastructure to really give that data the protection that it deserves, right? So right now we have structured journal prompts that make it so that we probably won't get, like, for instance, people were asking me if we could put a venting journal in the game. And I thought about that and I said, okay, but if we were to do that, the way we would program that is when you click the button that burns the page, like, it doesn't even send the data to our backend. It's like, it just stays local and disappears, you know? So it's just really, really interesting, the kind of things we need to do to keep our users safe. Yeah. And it sounds like you're doing some really cool stuff. So great.
And Rosemary, I know my clinical ears tickled when you said we de-identify the data. Yes. So how about you when you approach this?
We've been kind of lucky on our side. So we're a nonprofit. So for us, always, you know, the business decision goes to, okay, how can we get this done in the best, cheapest way possible? But we were very lucky because my background is in and also from our user researcher is in just traditional tech, and we're talking like huge systems. So I handled clients for Microsoft that did like 50 million and upwards, basically. And so, you know, we learned a lot about infrastructure there. And the people that do our back end side, they're quite high up in the architecture space in Microsoft. And so we got to really work with them to safely be able to both make sure that all the data is secure, that it's, you know, HIPAA compliant, that we encrypt, that all the good stuff that you need to do on a technical perspective. And then also we do like sort of we call them sort of schizophrenic personalities in the game and out of the game, where we just really sort of use like 4 levels of separating data from player IDs. And then we're working with, you know, Ernst & Young and some clinical psychologists to really then analyze that data, but they have no clue where that data even came from, never mind even being able to sort of tag that back to any kind of player. And we're also not, you know, we're not looking at journal entries as a whole. We're looking at themes, right? We're just looking at analyzing sort of patterns, if you will, on our side with that. The other data is more anonymous. I'm sure that's something that both Gabe and Swatee do as well. You know, how long do people play? How, what are the kind of things they get stuck on? Why do we think that is? Like if there's a question in also we have journaling prompts. So if we, at the beginning, for example, we noticed that people were jumping off at one specific question, we've reformulated, reframed it, and then, you know, retention went up for that, that period, for that, area in the game. We do, Gabe, we do have a blank page, but that people can just vent. I don't know what's on that yet because we're just doing all of that, you know, journal data analysis. So it'll be very interesting for me to see. I use it a lot. I like that more than the guided journaling prompts. But we also have a second layer of venting, right, with the art. And that's something where, you know, where we create like the simple art challenges, like saying, you know, if you feel upset, for example, paint a pattern with 4 colors and then break that pattern, and just really do something, you know, that's screamy above it. And I mean, we monitor everything, obviously, because we have to also, in our community, we have to make sure that it's all safe. We limit it a little bit more, I think, than Swatee and Gabe do on the community side with you know, comments and things like that. But on our side, we really wanted to limit it to the art and have that be your outside face, if you will, your way of communicating with others. And there's so many cool things, of course, that you can do with art, where you can really vent in different ways. That's it's been quite interesting to see how creative people get, even while saying, I'm not an artist, but here's my, you know, here's what I painted. And it's just, it's amazing.
Sarah, I was reading Catherine's question again, and she was actually asking about the clinical validation and the process that way. And so would it be okay if we address that question?
Yep, just real quickly, yeah, I think that's really important because it's giving a peek behind the curtain to how we actually come up with those numbers, and I think that's always an interesting thing for folks to hear about. For the record, for our viewers, when you're hearing things like HPI, HIPAA compliant, layers of de-identification, these are all things we use to make sure that the numbers we're producing from the information we're receiving are not attached to the person who's putting them into the games or into the study. And that way we can look at them without knowing who's there and just to see what people are telling us and then be able to give back that information while protecting the people. HIPAA is what guides doctors and clinicians and therapists in what kind of privacy practices we have to use. For example, you have to have all client files behind 2 passwords or locked doors. So go ahead, Swatee.
No, even in terms of clinical validation, there's a range of validation that you can do. The gold standard is a randomized control trial, and you see some, and that's usually reserved for drugs or like a heart transplant or a medical device. And that's been the tried and true way, but generally RCTs take years. That's why a lot of medical innovation takes a long time. With digital health, there's a new area called real world evidence, where it really looks at, and generally with anything you need what's called a control, meaning something that's a baseline that you can compare the change before and after. The screens that we were talking about before, they're usually, for example, administered before, like in our case, we administer it right when they sign up through the sign up process. It actually changed the way we onboard a person, and we took a hit in terms of number of users, but we got other data, right?
Sure.
And then you administer the same thing later, but then you also have to compare that to, if you're doing a control, you'd have to compare that to somebody else with an equivalent therapy or other places. And quite often at least in mental health, there's a quite well-established body of evidence around what a control is, but people still will require a control. So you can do RCTs. There's also retrospective versus prospective. Retrospective means you've collected the data already and you're doing an analysis on the back end. Prospective means we have a hypothesis and we're trying to test it out. So those are different elements of the clinical validation that you have. We're one of the first digital interventions to have any kind of clinical validation, and also using the new approach of real world evidence. So
beautiful. I love the way you put that. And then finally, just a really quick, in our last about 5 minutes here, I want to ask, beyond your games, as you, Rosemary, you brought this up before as well, there are many games that could benefit from incorporating mental health, and even when done appropriately and with the right amount of referrals and consultations, including mental illness in their designs and stories. Do you have any recommendations for the audience, for those in the games industry, on how to better address themes of mental health and mental illness?
Sure. I'm just gonna parrot a really brilliant person. I was watching the keynote from last year, Paul Fletcher for Senua and Hellblade. And I think what he was making the point was to not make, if you're going to have a character that is a mental illness, don't make the mental illness that character's entire personality.
Right.
Like, present them as a greater holistic being of which mental illness is a factor or a facet, but don't allow that to just define this character is depression character or this character is anxiety character. Like, you know, see if we can get a little bit more of a fuller, richer picture to help to bring the stigma down.
Excellent.
I think one thing, and this is what our users are always saying, like, people don't want to be reminded that there's something wrong with them, and that, and they're not necessarily, they just want to live their life and be, right? And so, you know, they don't need another thing on their plate to take care of. They just want to be and feel better. So if you're going to address mental health in any aspect, and, you know, integrating it as Gabe is talking about, making it a component of a character, but it can be part of the environment as well, right? If you're making a virtual world or these 3D worlds, adding vegetation in there to make it a more soothing experience, or areas where there's calm and peace, right? So I think if you're talking about that and you want to address, it doesn't have to be, hey, you've got anxiety here, you know, start doing breathing exercises. It can be by creating ambient environments or sounds also. That can be a part of it as well. So again, holistic design, not individual specific, what do you call it, touch points.
Yeah, like it doesn't have to always be part of the narrative. And with that, I think there's a bit of nuance around, like, representation of, well, the mainstream game that keeps popping into my head as we're having this conversation is We Happy Few. And for those who are unaware, it's a game about playing characters through an island community who is actively avoiding addressing a trauma that they have experienced as a group. And so they take this medication and it makes them feel happy. And it changes the visual environment, it changes the music, it changes the commentary you hear people say, it changes the way that you see yourself. But they do not only that environment, but there is some of it in the narrative. So that's an imperfect example to what you're addressing. But I think that there's a balanced nuance between being seen and feeling seen and represented in a game, and then also having it slapped in your face. I think you're absolutely right.
And I think those are all great points, and I would add to that you know, we're trying to give them an active role in their health. So the more you can do to really to facilitate that. So, you know, in our example, they level up through the stages of grief, if you will, right, in the game. And so giving them that active role of then also being able to choose when they go back to a certain stage, you know, that they're not stuck there, that that's what it is. I think that can help as well. So all of the narrative and all of the components of the game can help holistically, as you say, as well. And then just for I think for the mental illness component, just if you look at mainstream games, I would try to avoid things like, you know, it's a crazy person, just all those stigmas that you anyways find in the world. A lot of the games that I've seen so far, if there is a main character that has some kind of a mental illness, the story revolves around an insane asylum, or, you know, it's those types of things. And I think they're just a little bit dangerous, especially if you're trying to help people.
Right. Well, thank you all so much, panelists. Thank you all for watching, viewers, and we so appreciate your participation, engagement, and sticking around with us at the end of TIGS here. Again, if you have any questions, concerns, or feedback, you can find my contact information at www.takethis.org. Please go ahead and look up the games of our lovely panelists here, and thank you so much for sharing your expertise and being so open with us. And we appreciate you all attending this conference and panel today. Any closing words, panelists, before we segue to Eve here?
Just inspiring to be in shared company of a lot of people doing great things. Thanks for having us.
Yeah, we have our new app is coming out in a couple of days. So if people are interested, Sinasprite, SINASPRITE. So if anybody wants to give us feedback or wants to get in on the last part of the beta, like the last part of the user testing on this new build, let us know.
And we're in a similar situation. We're actively looking for testers. We got a grant from the Dutch government for our community part. So if anybody wants to help us test some of the new features that we're building, that would be fantastic. And just look us up on the shadowsedge.com. We really, really need some more testers to make this the best thing possible.
Excellent. Thank you all so much.
Thank you all. That was a fantastic way to finish this day of TIGS, and to the nuance with which you approached this was just really fantastic. And I think it really highlighted the range of things that we're trying to talk about here.